Greetings, my fellow freedom-loving sovereign thinkers. Thank you for tuning in to LL3 Podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful swampy mangroves of South Florida. And today's date is Thursday, November 5th, 2020. And I decided to do another show today. And the whole debacle with the elections. Of course, we got the Trump haters and the lovers and all that good stuff. And I was like, take the initiative on looking at through the Epoch Times. Strong accusations that a lot of stuff is happening. Poll workers not being honored. Poll watchers. They went through court orders and all that. And of course, in Philadelphia, the sheriff of the Philadelphia County not going to comply with the order. It shows you in the county of Philadelphia how much the sheriff really gives a damn about your rights as well. And, so going on up in Wisconsin about the recount, jumping to conclusions. Nevada did all the mail ballots, so it's just very interesting. Doesn't matter if you like President Trump or not, you always got to question these things. Like, it's funny about, like I said about in my earlier show about Arizona, they passed, there was no problem on the whole legalization of marijuana. Passed, boom, certified, done. But the whole presidential race. Yeah, a lot of claims, accusations, of course. And even some video footage of poll workers crumbling some papers that it could be about. We don't know. There's a lot of potential foul play. Or what they call it, ballot tampering. Vote fraud and all that. Yes, I can say, too, about, what does President Trump and Joe Biden have in common. They are proud supporters of Zionism. Not being anti-Semitic. Okay, so don't even go there. And of course, you got the haters, going after President Trump, and you got the Trump worshipers. There's no wrong. But I'm going to speak this with impartiality. There's a lot of suspicions and merit a case that there's a lot of voter election frauds going on. Flip-flopping and all that good stuff. Premature, false starts. They happened in Arizona. Very prematurely done according to their governor. And of course, like in Georgia, North Carolina, I was watching Idiot Box a little bit. All on the Epoch Times. Like 94% of the ballots have been counted. And now look what happened. Even though Trump is in the lead, but they stopped it, idolized it. Boom! So you have to always, like I said, question these things. If you could do it to him, anyone who's going to run in these positions can get shafted or treaded on as well. So this is why I'm not going to go on some high horse or bandwagon, anything like that, but it's the principle. That's one thing we have to always got to look at. If you can do it to him, it could be anyone else. You create a dangerous president. So I'll be back to talk something that's similar that occurred in 1946. So stay tuned. All right, we had a little train coming through here. So without further ado, let's talk about. I want to narrate a story that happened in around 1946. Mainly August 1st to the 2nd of that year. in Athens, Tennessee. The Battle of Athens, Tennessee. So I'm going to be talking about that, narrate the story here, which is from AmericanHeritage.com. The Battle of Athens. This is written by Loans Sieber. Around February, March 1985, to be exact. That's when it was written. 36 volume issue 2. Now, as it reads here, in McMinn County, Tennessee, in the early 1940s, the question was not if you farmed, but where you farmed. Athens, the county seat, lay between Knoxville and Chattanooga, along U.S. Highway 11, which wounds its way through eastern Tennessee. This was the meeting place for farmers from all the surrounding communities, traveling along narrow roads planted with signs urging them to see Rock City and get right with God. They would gather on Saturdays beneath the courthouse elms to discuss politics and crops. There were barely 7,000 people in Athens, and many of its streets were still unpaved. The two big cities, some 50 miles away, had not yet begun their inevitable expansion, and the farmers' lives were simple and essentially unaffected by what they could have called the modern world. Many of them were without electricity. The land, their families, religion, politics, and the war dominated their talk and thoughts. They learned from God, from the family Bible, in the tiny chapels along yellow dust roads. Their newspaper, the Daily Post Athenian, told them something of politics and war, but since it chose to avoid intrigue or scandal, a story that smacked of both could be found only in the conversations of the folks who milled about the courthouse lawn on Saturdays. Since the Civil War, political offices in McMinn County had gone to the Republicans, but in the 1930s, Tennessee began to fall under the control of the Democratic bosses. To the west in Shelby County, E.H. Crump, the Memphis mayor who has been ousted during his term for failing to enforce prohibition, fathered what could become the state's most powerful political machine. Interesting there, right? Crump eventually controlled most of Tennessee along with the governor's office and the United States Senator. Eastern Tennessee, local and regional machines developed, which, lacking the sophistication and power of a Crump, relied on intimidation and violence to control their constituents. In 1936, descended upon McMinn County in the person of one Paul Cantrell, the Democratic candidate for sheriff. Cantrell, who came from a family of money and influence in nearby Etowah, tied his campaign closely to the popularity of the Roosevelt administration and rode FDR's coattails to victory over his Republican opponent. Fraud was suspected. To this day, many Athens citizens firmly believe that ballot boxes were swapped, but there was no proof. Over the following months and years, however, those who questioned the election would see that their suspicions vindicated. The laws of Tennessee provided an opportunity for the unscrupulous to prosper. The sheriff and his deputies received a fee for every person they booked, incarcerated, and released. The more human transactions, the more money they got. A voucher signed by the sheriff was all that was needed to collect the money from the courthouse. Deputies routinely boarded buses passing through and dragged sleepy-eyed passengers to the jail to pay their $16.50 fine for drunkenness, whether they were guilty or not. Arrests ran as high as 115 per weekend. The fee system was profitable, but record-keeping was required, and the money could be traced. It was less troublesome to collect kickbacks for allowing roadhouses to operate openly. Cooperative owners would point out influential patrons. They were not bothered, but the rest were subject to shakedowns. Prostitution, liquor, and gambling grew so prevalent that it became common knowledge in Tennessee that Athens was wide open. Encouraged by his initial success, Cantrell began what could become 10-year reign as the king of McMinn politics. In subsequent elections, ballot boxes were collected from the precincts and resulted tabulated in secret at McMinn County Jail in Athens. Opposition poll watchers were labeled as troublemakers and ejected from precinct houses. Sounds familiar, folks? The 1940 election sent George Woods, a plump and affable Iroquois crony of Cantrell, to the state legislature. Woods promptly introduced an act to redistrict McMinn County. It reduced the number of voting precincts from 23 to 12 and cut down the number of justices of the peace from 14 to 7. Of these 7, 4 were openly Cantrell men. When Governor Prentice Cooper signed Woods' bill into law on February 15, 1941, effective Republican opposition died in McMinn County. McMinn County Court, which was still dominated by Republicans, directed the county to purchase voting machines. The Cantrell Democrats countered by having Woods get a bill passed in Nashville abolishing the court and then selling the machines to save the county money. Those are quotes, okay? Department of Justice records show investigations of electoral fraud in McMinn County in 1940, 1942, and 1944, all without resolution. During the Civil War, deep from within secessionist territory, McMinn County has sided with the Union. That's what they call it, the volunteer state. In 1998, she had declared war on Spain 2 weeks before Washington got around to it. How could Cantrell have such undisputed control over a county noted for its independent and cantankerous spirit? One answer lies in the Second World War. 3,526 young men, or about 10% of McMinn's population, went off to fight. Most of those left behind, older and perhaps more timid, contributed to the Cantrell machines. Growth by remaining silent. Still, as the war dragged on, people began to tell each other, wait until the GIs get back. Things will be different. In the summer of 1945, veterans began returning home. By 1946, the streets of Athens overflowed with uniforms. The Cantrell forces were not worried. The more GIs they arrest, one vet recalled, the more they beat up, the madder we got. It'll be hitting the next page here, which is cool. Bill White recalled coming home from overseas with mustering out pay in his pocket. There were several beer joints and honky-tonks around Athens. We were pretty wild. We started having trouble with law enforcement at the same time because they started making a habit of picking up GIs and finding them heavily for most anything. They were kind of making a racket out of it. Quote, after a long, hard years of service, most of us were hardcore veterans of World War II. We were used to drinking our liquor and our beer without being molested. When these things happened, the GIs got madder. The more the GIs they arrested, the more they beat up, the madder we got. At least the veterans chose to use the most basic right of the democracy for which they had gone to war, the right to vote. In early months of 1946, they decided to, in secret meetings, to field a slate of their own candidates for August elections. In May, they formed a nonpartisan political party. As the election approached, there were a few overt signs of impending trouble. Although to the citizens of McMinn County, it was apparent that something had to happen. There was too much at stake on both sides. The Daily Post Athenian was characteristically silent. The most significant news item appeared on election eve, July 31st, 1946. At the bottom of page 1, VFW members in neighboring Blount County said that 450 veterans were ready to respond to any need in McMinn County. Above this was a report that Tony Pierce had a killer muskrat in his front yard. The veterans fielded candidates for 5 offices, but interest centered on the race for sheriff between Knox Henry, who had served in the North African campaign, and Paul Cantrell. Since the 1936 election, Cantrell had gone on the legislature as state senator and installed Pat Mansfield as sheriff of McMinn County, a big, jovial, sometime engineer for the Louisville and Nashville. Mansfield had done very nicely for himself during his term of office. His 4 years as sheriff had netted him an estimated $104,000. Back then, that was some big money, okay? But now, in 1946, Cantrell run for sheriff and Mansfield for state senator. In the final week, a flurry of advertisements appeared in the Post Athenian. Cantrell enumerated the accomplishments of the Democratic Party. Mansfield denied that 2 men arrested on July 30th with a shipment of liquor were deputies, even though they admitted they were and had been delivered election whiskey. Downtown merchants announced that all stores would be closed on Election Day to give employees a chance to vote. Although this had not been necessary in previous elections, the merchants were perhaps following the example of the mayor of Athens, Paul Walker, who would be vacationing on Election Day. Cantrell warned that the veterans had printed sample ballots with the intention of stuffing ballot boxes. The veterans offered a $1,000 reward for verifiable information about election fraud and repeated a slogan that for weeks had sounded again and again from their car-mounted loudspeakers: "Your vote will be counted as cast." 2 days before the election, the GIs ran an advertisement in the Post Athenian. These young men fought and won a war for good government. They know what it takes and what it means to have a clean government. And they are energetic, honest enough, honest enough, and intelligent enough to give us good, clean government. A couple of pages farther on, the Democrats had their say. Look at the facts, and you will vote for the Democratic ticket. The campaign fight is old as the hills. It is the story of the outs wanting back in. The next day, the paper reported that veterans from Blount County had offered to come help with the polls. Help watch the polls. Mansfield began building an army of its own. It has come to my attention, as quote, he announced, quote, that certain elements intended to create a disturbance at and around the polls in order to see what law and order is maintained. I will have several hundred deputies patrolling the county, unquote. He hired all of them from outside the county, some from out of state. They would crowd inside every voting precinct, and they would be armed. August 1st, 1946, Election Day found voters lined up early in the largest turnout in local history. Joining them were some 300 of Sheriff Mansfield's special deputies. Trouble began early. At 9:30 a.m., Walter Ellis, a legally appointed GI representative at the 1st Precinct in the courthouse, was arrested and jailed for protesting irregularities. Sirens wailed throughout the morning, and police cruisers were seen speeding toward the jail. GIs began gathering on Washington Street outside L.L. Schaefer's jewelry store, which served as an office for their campaign manager, Jim Buttram, who has seen action in Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. Above the door sign read Phone 787, Jim Buttram, the number to which voters were to report election fraud. Only after prolonged pounding did the hairy Buttram cautiously open the door to his comrades. As more than 200 GIs filled the small store, the somber mood of their leader told them they were in trouble. He showed them copies of 2 telegrams dated July 22nd. One he had addressed to Governor Jim McCord, Nashville, Tennessee. The other to Attorney General Tom Clark, Washington, D.C. They requested assistance to ensure a fair election. Neither had been answered. Okay? This is interesting, folks. So I'm going to continue on here. Otto Kennedy, not an ex-GI himself, but a political advisor to the veterans, entered the office and announced that Cantrell had posted armed guards at each precinct. They all knew that this move was in preparation for the 4 p.m. poll closing, when the ballot boxes would be moved to the jail for the counting. A small group of veterans demanded an armed mobilization and called for a leader. Buttram declined. So did Kennedy, but he offered the rear of his SK garage and tire shop across the street as a meeting hall. The group crossed the street, held a meeting, and agreed that those who did not have weapons should get them and return as quickly as possible. By 3 p.m., most were backed at the SNK and most were armed. At about this time, Tom Gillespie, an elderly black man farmer from Union Road, stepped inside the 11th Precinct polling place in Athens Waterworks on Jackson Street. Windy Wise, a Cantrell guard, told Gillespie, quote, "Nigger, you can't vote here." That's what it says, all right? Unquote. When Tom protested, Wise struck him with brass knuckles. Gillespie dropped his ballot and ran for the door. Wise pulled a pistol and shot him in the back as he reached the sidewalk. The first shot of the day brought crowds streaming up Jackson from the courthouse. Sheriff Mansfield's cruisers turned off College Street and screeched to a halt in front of the waterworks, and deputies loaded the bleeding Gillespie into the car. Mansfield ordered the precinct closed, posted 4 deputies outside to guard the waterworks, and then took Gillespie to jail. Beat them when they're down, right? A dozen veterans from the SNK started up Jackson toward the waterworks. They were unarmed. During the confusion following the shooting, the 2 GI poll watchers, Ed Vestal and Charles Scott, had been seized and held hostage inside the waterworks by Wise and another Cantrell deputy, Carl Neal. When the veterans reached the waterworks, the crowd began taunting the armed guards as Wise and Neal stood at the window watching the angry throng outside. Vestal and Scott plunged through the plate glass window and ran bleeding from the protection of the crowd. Wise stepped through the broken glass, waving his pistol. Several veterans rushed toward, but were quickly pulled back to safety. One of them shouted, "Let's go get our guns." And they left, for the S&K. In the meantime, Chief Deputy Bo Dunn had his men form a cordon from the building to his cruiser, and the ballot box was carried out to the car. Wise told Dunn about the GI's threat. The chief deputy ordered 2 of his men to GI headquarters to arrest those whom Wise could identify. The rest of the deputies piled into the cruiser, which sped back toward the jail. When the 2 deputies reached the GI headquarters, they were disarmed and taken prisoner. So were 2 others sent later as reinforcements. All right. A crowd began to gather outside. 3 more deputies came with pistols drawn, only to be pummeled and dragged inside. The crowd began to demand the lives of their captives. Some of the veterans agree. This talk alarmed Otto Kennedy, and he left, vowing to have no part in murder. The crowd began to disperse, and most of the GIs left. Soon a small nucleus of veterans was alone with 7 hostages. The veterans took the hostages to the woods, 10 miles out of town, beat them, and shackled them to trees. A polling place for the 12th precinct had been set up in the back of the Dixie Cafe, across Hornsby Alley from the jail, and it was commanded by Minus Wilburn for Cantrell. Bobby Harrell and Leslie Dooley, who had lost an arm in North Africa, were assigned as the GI poll watchers. Throughout the day, they had observed Wilburn letting minors vote and handing cash to adult voters. At 3:45 p.m., when Wilburn attempted to allow a young woman to vote despite the fact that she had no poll tax receipt and that her name did not appear on the registration list, Harrell's patient gave out. As Wilburn reached to deposit the ballot, Harrell grabbed his wrist. Wilburn slapped him across the head with a blackjack and kicked him in the face as he fell to the floor. Then they closed the precinct, ordered Hornsby Alley blocked at both ends, and the procession of guards crossed the lawn to the jail with the ballot box and the GIs as captives. And the Cantrell forces had calculated that if they could control the 1st, 11th, and 12th precincts in Athens, and the one in Etowah, the election was theirs. The ballot boxes from Waterworks, the 11th, and the Dixie Cafe, the 12th, were safely in the jail. The voting place for the 1st precinct, the courthouse, was barricaded by deputies who held 4 GIs hostage, and Paul Cantrell himself had Etowah under control. Interesting story so far, folks, and I'll let you guys know. I just skimmed through this, so I'm learning as well. There's a lot more details in this one. By 6 p.m., it seemed to be over. GI headquarters was deserted, and unhappy crowds moved quietly along the streets. Another election had been stolen, and nothing could be done about it. At the Strand movie theater across from the courthouse, the marquee read, "Coming soon, gunning for vengeance." Bill White, who had fought in the Pacific while still in his teens and come home, an ex-sergeant, had gotten angry as the day wore on. At 2 in the afternoon, he had, harangued the group of veterans in the S&K, saying, quote, "You call yourselves GIs? You go over there and fight for 3 and 4 years. You come back and you let a bunch of draft dodgers who stayed here where it was safe, and you're making it safe for them, push you around. If you people don't stop this, and now is the time and place, you people won't make a pimple on a fighting GI's ass. Get guns, unquote. In the early evening, White went to get the guns himself. He sent 2 GIs to get a truck with a few other veterans, perhaps a dozen. He headed for the National Guard Armory. There he said in a 1969 interview, he, quote, broke down the armory doors and took all the rifles, 2 Thompson submachine guns, and all the ammunition we can carry. Loaded up in the 2-ton truck and went back to GI headquarters and passed out 70 high-powered rifles and 2 bandoliers of ammunition with each one. By 9 p.m., Paul Cantrell, Pat Mansfield, State Representative George Woods, who was also a member of the election committee, and about 50 deputies were locked inside the jail and going through the ballot boxes. The presence of Mansfield and Woods meant that a majority of the election commission was on hand, so the tallies could be certified and validated on the spot. More deputies were still barricaded in the courthouse, but along the streets none were to be seen. If the Cantrell forces had a bit more wary, they might have spotted some shadows slipping up the embankment directly across the street from the jail. Opinions differ on exactly how the challenge was issued. White said he was the one to call it out. Quote, would you damn bastards bring those damn ballot boxes out here, or we are going to set siege against the jail and blow it down, unquote. Moments later, the night exploded in automatic weapons, fire punctuated by shotgun blast. Quote, I heard the first shot, White claimed. Quote, then everybody started shooting from our side. A deputy ran for the jail. I shot him. He wheeled and fell inside the jail, unquote. Bullets ricocheted up and down White Street. A shot a second man. His leg flew from under him, and he crawled under the car. Veterans bombarded the jail for hours, but Cantrell and his accomplices, secure behind the red brick walls, refused to surrender. As the uncertain battle dragged past midnight, the GIs began to have some uneasy second thoughts. They knew they had violated local, state, and federal laws that night, and if Cantrell was not routed before his rescuers arrived, they might spend the rest of their lives in prison. Rumors compounded their fears. Quote, the National Guard's on the way, unquote. The state troopers are here. That's quoted too. And more quotes here. Birch Biggs and its gang are coming. Biggs ran Polk County more ruthlessly than Cantrell ran McMinn. If the veterans had known the truth, they would have been less apprehensive. George Woods had telephoned Biggs earlier that night for help. Biggs was not there, but his son, Broughton, took the call. His answer, do you think I'm crazy? Woods then slipped out of town. Oh, man, that's funny. The veterans were eager to end their battle. Some of them made Molotov cocktails. Others went to the county supply house for dynamite. The gasoline bombs proved ineffective, but at 2:30 a.m., the dynamite arrived. At about this time, an ambulance pulled around to the north of the side of the jail. Assuming it was for the evacuation of the wounded, the veterans let it pass. 2 men jumped in, but then instead of returning to the hospital, the ambulance sped north out of town. The men were Paul Cantrell and Pat Mansfield. At 2:48 a.m., the first dynamite was tossed toward the jail. It landed under Bo Dunn's cruiser, and the explosion flipped the vehicle over on its top, leaving its wheels spinning. 3 more bundles of dynamite were thrown almost simultaneously. One landed on the jail porch roof, another under Mansfield's car, and the third struck the jail wall. The explosion rattled windows throughout the town. Leaves fell from the trees, debris scattered for blocks, and the jailhouse porch jumped off its foundation. The deputies barricaded in the courthouse a block away rushed onto the balcony, eager to surrender. The jail defenders staggered from their ruined stronghold and handed the ballot boxes over to the veterans. With the Cantrell forces conquered, 10 years of suppressed rage exploded. The townspeople set upon the captured deputies and, but for the GIs, probably would have killed them all. Minus Wilbur, a particularly unpopular deputy, had his throat slashed. Biscuit Ferris, Cantrell's prison superintendent, and his jaw shattered by a bullet. And Wendy Wise was kicked and beaten senseless. Joined by a number of their fellows, the GIs cleared the jail of the rioters and locked up their prisoners for the night. I'll be right back. Alright, sorry about that, gang. Over here, it'll be pretty confoundedly rude. So I'll continue on here. At dawn, the veterans slipped from the jail, made their way through the detritus of the battle, and dispersed into what they hoped would be anonymity. Miraculously, there had been no deaths, but on August 2nd, a page 1 headline in the New York Times wrongly trumpeted in the news, Tennessee sheriff is slain in primary day of violence. All day long, reporters with cameras and notebooks poured into town to photograph, question, and analyze and write. And every newcomer passed a sign on Highway 11, "Welcome to Athens, the friendly city." The victory of the veterans that night in August 1946 appeared at first to have settled nothing. The national press was almost unanimous in condemning this action of the GIs. In an editorial perhaps best reflecting the ambivalence of a startled nation, the New York Times concluded corruption, when and where it exists, demands reform, and even in the most corrupt and boss-ridden communities. There are peaceful means by which reform can be achieved, but there is no substitute in a democracy for the orderly process. That was quoted, okay? The syndicated columnist Robert C. Ruark commented, "There is very little difference, essentially, between a vigilante and a member of the lynch mob. And if we were seeking an answer to crooked politics, the one that the Athens boys just propounded sure ain't it." Unquote. Common wheel cautiously compared the battle to the American Revolution. Then went on to say that nothing could be more dangerous both for our liberties and our welfare than the making of the McMinn County Revolution into a habit. That finished quote. In the early days of August 1946, a power vacuum existed in McMinn County that easily could have spawned anarchy. Armed GIs patrolled the streets that were still tense with rumors of a Mansfield army poised to reclaim Athens. Hundreds of men were issued permits to carry weapons. A machine gun on rooftops guarded the approaches to town. Several times groups of veterans rushed to barricade roads, and occasionally they terrorized innocent travelers in their attempt to thwart an invasion that never came. On August 4th, Paul Mansfield telegraphed his resignation as sheriff of McMinn County to Governor McCord and requested that Knox Henry fill his unexpired term, which would end on September 1st. Henry was appointed immediately, and the next day, State Representative George Woods returned to the county under GI protection to convene the election commission and certify the election. A cheer rang out in the courthouse when Woods rose as the canvass ended. And announced that Knox Henry was elected sheriff by a vote of 2,175 to 1,270. On August 11, 1946, the 5 GIs elected to office, and McMinn announced that they would return to the county all fees in excess of $5,000. Elsewhere in Tennessee, E.H. Crump and his machine were finally on the way out. With the election of Governor Gordon Browning and a young United States Senator, Estee Kefauver. A full year afterward, the national press seized upon the most significant news from Athens as evidence of the veterans' lawlessness. There was indeed remarkably little criminal prosecution in the wake of that violent night. Only one man had charges brought against him, Windy Wise, the deputy who shot the old black farmer, Tommy DeClimps, drew a sentence of 1 to 3 years. As for the larger results of the Athens Rebellion, the GIs universally hailed the return of the independent vote to the community and the election of fine people to lead it. The national press continued to show interest in what had happened. The best, if incomplete, account of it at the time was Harper's article by Theodore White. Finally, on the first anniversary of the violent election, the Times reported, today that this political coalition of World War II veterans for direction in community affairs, which many at the time regarded as a factor likely to develop nationally in the post-war period, was purely a local phenomenon in which veterans' participation was incidental. With this epilogue, the press turned away from tiny Athens. Knox Henry served 2 terms as sheriff of McMinn County and was succeeded by Otto Kennedy. Paul Cantrell, after seeking temporary asylum in Chattanooga, returned to Etowah and continued to operate the bank there with his brothers. They all are dead now, as is Jim Brutnam. Otto Kennedy still lives in Athens. Paul Mansfield returned secretly to Athens on August 8, 1946, to resign his membership on the Election Commission. He met with Otto Kennedy for 2 hours. Apparently, no ill feeling on the other side. And then announced, I'm through with politics for good. It'll sure mess you up sometimes. I'm going back to railroading. Interesting there. Looks like he took responsibility for his actions, right? Athens has not changed that much in 40 years. There's a new courthouse and imposing structure that is too large for its site. The old burnt down during renovations in 1964. Farmers no longer gather on the square. There is no place for them. And an effort at downtown renovation can only be described as timid, a cautious imitation of similar projects in the larger cities. They have a new jail and hostelry building that seem to embody the adage that crime does not pay. The Daily Post Athens is alive and well, and still comfortably middle of the road. In the mid-50s, Athens was isolated by a new highway that intercepts Highway 11, south of Nyota, and rejoins it at Riceville. Along it, a new Athens grew a town of McDonald's, Kawasaki, and Pizza Hut. If you ask the people along the street about the election of August 1946, they will point up White Street and mumble something vague about a shootout. There are no signs or monuments to commemorate the event. People have forgotten or do not wish to remember. But the grain manager of a local store, a friendly sort, and so gentle with his grandchildren, squeezed off round after round at the jail that night. And the driver snoozing behind the wheel of his cab, not really caring whether he watches a fare or not, helped wrap and toss the deadly bundles of dynamite that sailed through the night air. You can bet they remember. Well, well, well. That's one historical event. Very powerful indeed. The reason why I narrate the story, because Lord forbid it can happen again. What we're observing right now can lead to this, what occurred on August 1st and 2nd of 1946. If you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. It's to reminders that anyone's going to play corrupt politics, including individuals' right to vote. It can burn you when least expected. So if you take these jobs for granted, you'd be cursing yourself. You all have obligations and responsibilities. And you got poll observers. Let them do it in good faith. If you're doing 100 feet away, don't even go there. They have the right to watch you. It's called transparency, with no exceptions. As long as you go by the rules, you better damn administer it. Because this can be called treason. And that can lead to death if convicted through due process. So what's your decision on this? Support your principles or your party? You know, many of you out there understand what my position is. And hopefully you will feel the same. And that is it. I want to thank everyone for listening. Plus, feel free to download and share us throughout your social media networks. If you have any questions, comments, or if there's something interesting you want to check out, whatever you do, please send your correspondence to Quorum. I will leave this article link on my Spreaker page. And if you want to send me an email on the question and so forth, you can hit me at lookyourluck3@gmail.com or lookyourlucknumbers03@protonmail.com. I prefer that instead. Okay? If you want to do a donation, you can hit me at paypal.me/lookyourluck3 and support the site, which I narrate the story. They need some love as well. Once again, thank you for your time. Plus, always remember that demoniac resistance is healthy for the soul and can liberate humanity. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading love. And may your guardian spirits be with you.